Welcome to the Behaviour Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behaviour Speak podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben, and today we're excited to get back into my home country to interview another wonderful researcher. We're heading over to Ontario, to St. Catharines, Ontario, and Brock University, and talking with Dr. Valdeep Saini. Thanks for coming on the show, Val.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Awesome. We had an earlier episode with with a couple of your colleagues and co-authors, Alison Cox and then Louis Busch before that. So it's fun to sort of continue the conversation with Brock, and I do have Dr. I believe is it Burnham Riosa? Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah,
she's on the short list to sort of connect with me in January for potentially another one. So
great.
We're gonna have a nice Brock series going on, which is wonderful. There's so much good work coming out of your university, and your work is certainly no exception. What I kind of like to do with all my guests is sort of steal from a lot of the other podcast host models and get a bit of an origin story. We'd love to hear kind of how you got into the field of behavior analysis, sort of from the beginnings there to the point of becoming a professor and researcher at Brock University.
Sure. So I guess probably the best place to start is undergrad. I feel like that's probably where a lot of people start to get into behavior analysis, or at least start to get exposed to it. So I did my undergrad in kind of general psychology. I didn't really have much exposure to behavior analysis or behavior science at that time, but I was always interested in kind of the inner workings of why people kind of do what they do, and thinking about the reasons for behavior, although I wasn't really ever taught about that. So I graduated with my psychology degree, and I was at the point where I was sort of thinking about, well, what can I do with this degree? And there wasn't really any immediate opportunities or prospects on my horizon. But I had a friend who was working with a young boy with autism, and he was implementing what we would now call intensive behavioral intervention. Although back then, I'm not sure if that term was used. And I thought to myself, well, I can probably do this. And so I kind of got connected with him, and I started working in the autism field and implementing behavioral intervention with a few kids diagnosed with autism. And through that experience, I learned a little bit more about behavior analysis, not really too much about the science behind it, but a little bit about the procedures and kind of what the end goal of this intervention was. And so through a little bit of digging, I learned that there was kind of this intensive behavioral science program at George Brown that was designed for folks who had completed undergraduate degrees in psychology, but wanted specific training in behavioral science, which was great for me because that was kind of the exact situation that I was in. I was kind of exposed to some behavioral intervention. I had a psychology degree, so I thought, you know what, this is only going to take 9 months or 10 months to get this certificate. I'll go for it. I'll try it. And that was really my first exposure to applied behavior analysis in any type of educational setting. And it was a great experience, and I met a ton of great people. In fact, that's where I met Louis Busch, who you mentioned earlier. He was actually a professor of mine at that time. And so it was a great learning experience at George Brown. And after I had that experience, I started to think about assessment and treatment of behavior disorders, which is a little bit different than what I was currently doing. But I was learning about it, and I thought, well, this is interesting. This seems like something that I could be good at, or at least help in. And through that kind of interest and through some practicum experiences at George Brown, I was able to get connected to the right people to do some of that work. This was mostly in group home settings with adults who engaged in severe behavior disorders. And I did that for about maybe a year before I thought to myself, I really want to kind of take this further and learn more about this and really kind of get into the science behind all of this. Because even at George Brown, I was still focused mostly on intervention and not so much the science. And so at that point, I decided to go down to Florida to get my master's degree in applied behavior analysis. So at that time, there wasn't as many opportunities to study behavior analysis as there are now in Ontario. So I decided to go down there. And in that setting, I did a little bit more of both. I did more kind of early intensive behavioral intervention work, and I did also some problem behavior work. And that's really where I started to get interested in kind of research in behavior analysis. And what I started to learn was that I had more questions than there were answers for in our field. And so I thought to myself, well, I want to kind of to find the answers to these questions because somebody needs to do this work. So when I finished my master's degree in Florida, I was lucky enough to get hooked up with Wayne Fisher at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, who is really a pioneer in our field in the assessment and treatment of severe behavior disorders. And so I worked with Wayne in Nebraska for about 3 years. I got my Ph.D. With him as well. And my work was primarily focused on the assessment and treatment of problem behavior. But what was really cool about that setting is that Wayne sort of introduced me to this new approach to studying problem behavior. And that was through the lens of translational research. And what his kind of perspective was that we can make much better advancements in not only the treatment of problem behavior, but really anywhere in behavioral science if we take this approach of understanding it through a basic perspective. In other words, can we take something we know about the way behavior works, studied in an experimental laboratory, and use that information to develop better treatments, better interventions, or study some of the processes that we see when treating behavior disorders. And so a lot of my work kind of started to focus on using this translational approach to study behavior problems, which was a lot different than my initial experience to problem behavior when I was at George Brown. And so I had a great experience there. And after I obtained my PhD, I started working with Dr. Hank Rohn in New York, upstate New York. And he also had a very similar type of perspective on treating problem behavior. And I started to learn a lot about how kind of these preeminent figures in our field actually study problem behavior and really through this more translational lens. And so I did a lot of great work in upstate New York. I actually started doing some work in pediatric feeding disorders as well while I was there, mostly focusing on kind of the problem behaviors that emerge around feeding issues, kind of things like food refusal and food selectivity. So that was a great experience as well because it was kind of my first real exposure to treating feeding problems. And so things kind of snowballed from there, and I've just kind of always continued to work in this area of problem behavior and studying it through this translational lens. Fortunately, I've been exposed to some other areas as well, like kind of data analysis and social issues. And a lot of that work has really been a product of the grad students I've been working with and some of my colleagues. So it's nice that I'm kind of exposed to these other applications of applied behavior analysis, but I would still say that a lot of what I do is working on bettering interventions for behavior disorders through this kind of translational perspective.
Cool. Really cool. That's a great overview. And it explains a few things for me. So often when I'm looking for guests, I usually head over to, I'll take recommendations from folks, of course, and I'll head over to the universities I'm familiar with and see what folks are doing. But often I'm just headed to Google Scholar or ResearchGate and kind of seeing what's going on. And your name came up primarily through Louis because you were a co-author on several of the papers that him and I had discussed. And so it made a lot of sense to check in and see what you're up to. And looking through the different areas, I was like, this guy's done a lot of different things, and he seems like a pretty young guy. And he's been through into feeding, like you said, into some of this renewal relapse stuff, some of this other kind of problem behavior stuff. It's just seemed to be a wide range of sort of topics. And I was like, does he specialize in anything? Was sort of the internal kind of verbal behavior I was going through. But your overview makes a lot more sense, because you kind of went from, and this probably would explain, that scenario for a lot of different folks, kind of if they train in sort of different schools. I think a lot of these folks, will do their bachelor, master's, and PhD all in the same place, and really sort of hone their focus on one topic. But it sounds like, you got a really, neat exposure, especially as a Canadian, kind of heading down to the States and kind of bouncing around to all these different, essentially kind of gurus in the field, and learning from them and sort of practicing those areas. Wayne Fisher, that's a name I sort of associate with feeding too. Is that correct?
He does do a little bit of feeding work. So at University of Nebraska Medical Center, there was a feeding clinic. It was actually run by Dr. Kathleen Piazza.
Of course, yes.
But I believe, they've worked together on a number of things. So
yes,
you probably have seen his name on a couple of
that may be what it is. Yeah. Seeing their names together. So anyway, and then Hank as well. Yeah, a really nice sort of well-rounded education you definitely had. And then sort of from there, what was it that brought you back to Brock, or was sort of Canada always sort of in the long-term plan to return?
It was always on the plan to return. But one thing that kind of I was always been thinking about was, I think there's a lot to offer in terms of education here in Ontario, and I always want to kind of take the things that I've experienced and learned and bring them back here. And so folks who are in my situation where they want to learn about ABA, they're not kind of forced into going to another country or another place, that they can get that experience here. And we really developed such a strong program at Brock for that. And I think that's one of the reasons why our program is so attractive to so many people, is that we have so many great faculty who have so many, wonderful and diverse experiences and backgrounds, that we're able to kind of provide that now for the next generation of folks who want to get into this field.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I'm so grateful now that there are more opportunities sort of for folks to do that. Just this is still a bit of an aside here, but I know one issue that a lot of my colleagues run into is the lack of Ph.D. programs in Canada. Does Brock have one in ABA, or in the sort of applied disability studies title that they kind of use?
We don't currently have a PhD program. That's something that we've definitely discussed and thought about, and has been on the horizon. It's something that I think is certainly warranted and needed in not only in Ontario, but really across Canada. There's not a lot of opportunities. And one of the difficulties with starting a program like that is finding all the right people who can actually run it, right? So I think, we're in a great position at Brock to be able to start thinking about that, and potentially, maybe even moving forward on that type of program. So I certainly agree with you that I think that, we need that, and hoping that it will come around soon.
Yeah, I just got so many colleagues that are, usually it's either, so they're often looking for online programs because they don't want to leave Canada. And so they either end up at the Chicago School, which seems to be, which a wonderful program, absolutely. But, quite cost prohibitive for Canadians in particular. It's a pricey place to go. And then beyond that, it seems like a lot of folks are doing online work with the Queen's University Belfast program. And so it just seems to me like, there would definitely be a demand in Canada for a local program. So that's great that it's sort of in your minds anyway, and maybe down the road we'll see one. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. And one thing that we kind of really learned a lot last year about virtual learning, and we kind of all forced online because of the pandemic, was that students really like to be in person. They like to be in the classroom. They like to interact with one another. They like to see their professor, so I think that you're right. I think there's something to say about kind of this local program and being in person and being able to kind of interact with those around you.
Yeah. And with Ontario and BC sort of being, sort of the most densely populated provinces in terms of, BCBAs, and UBC is sort of the only option, I guess. Well, we're the only option in Canada right now for a specific kind of Ph.D. There's limited seats, there's limited opportunities. There's only a couple of 2 or 3 professors in there taking on students, and so I could definitely see a lot of folks from our neck of the woods heading your way if something like that became available. And I think it would also be really cool, and I'm sure it will happen. Something that I think is missing, from I went to UBC and did my master's there, and I think something that's really missing from training programs in Canada, and we're going to get into this shortly here, is anything on basic research. There are no experimental labs beyond maybe. I guess there might be one in Manitoba. I could see there maybe being one there, just because they've been around for so long. I always forget about University of Manitoba when I'm thinking about these things. But there's a lack of that piece, and that was something I didn't learn much about at all when I did my program.
Yeah, and that's fairly common, not only in Canada, but even from, at least what I understand, that basic laboratory, basic behavioral science. There's less of an appetite for that type of program lately. And I think maybe part of the reason for that is that, applied behavior analysis has grown considerably in the past few decades.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that, there's something to definitely say about basic behavioral sciences and getting training in that, because one thing I always try to communicate is that everything that we do in applied behavior analysis has foundations in experimental analyses, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can't lose sight of the fact that, all of this work that we do in clinical activity comes from somewhere and it has a foundation. And if we lose that piece of it, then, we won't be able to kind of progress and develop even further kind of building blocks for applied behavior analysis. So I'm definitely of the opinion that, we need more of that type of work.
Yeah, for sure. And I know, at least from my perspective, I had a bunch of copies of GAB sitting on my shelf, and did I open any of them? No, never. And I had a colleague who's at the Chicago School right now, and she was excited to get that box of books from me. But it's hard to, if you haven't had the training and you haven't had the background, it's hard to open up the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior and pick up an article and start reading it and have any idea what the authors are talking about, unless you've kind of had that background. So one thing I do like about at least this first, so we're going to talk about a few studies that you've been involved in. And one thing I really like about this first study, although it is complicated I think it's going to take a few more reads before I completely grasp it. But you're talking about EAB kind of related concepts, but you're using, this particular study we're talking it's called Renewal During Functional Communication Training, and so you're talking about FCT, which is a thing that I think a lot of applied behavior analysts should be familiar with and should know something about. So there's that familiarity piece, and the second piece is that and I wasn't aware that there was, and I don't know much about basic research at all, but I wasn't aware that folks did basic research with humans. And so the fact that you're using humans, I think, makes it a bit, a bit more consumable for someone who's, like myself, who doesn't have a lot of background in that area. So maybe we can just kind of get into this article a little bit. And we could kind of talk about what you did, but also talk about the bigger picture around sort of translational research. If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to go to www.cbiconsultants.com and enter the 3 secret words. The first secret word is translation.
Sure. I guess I'll start by saying that, there's definitely more interest in translational research, not only in behavioral sciences and behavior analysis, but really in all kind of research. And that's because I think a lot of people have recognized that it takes a lot of time to create something in a laboratory and turn it into something that's useful in practice. That's not a very quick process. And so some years ago, the National Institutes of Health, it's a US granting agency, they started to put out calls for translational research because the goal was to develop research projects that sort of accelerate the way we think about basic research and applied research and that continuum between the two. And can we progress faster? Can we move sort of from bench to bedside in a more efficient way? And so they were really interested in putting money into translational research and seeing if there's a way to kind of speed up this process. And so some of the translational research that we do in applied behavior analysis and EAB is designed to kind of meet that aim: is can we more efficiently move from a basic experimental laboratory procedure to something that we can actually use in practice, maybe for a clinical purpose. There's also the reverse of that as well, which is that sometimes we come into situations in applied practice where we really need to understand what's happening here at kind of a fundamental level. But might not be appropriate to study that in an applied setting. So what we can do is we take that problem and we try to recreate it in experimental laboratories, sometimes using humans, sometimes using non-human animals, and we try to recreate that problem and study it there. So there's this nice kind of interplay between applied and experimental work, and each sort of informs the other when we're doing translational research.
Well, that's really cool. So what was this? So what this study? I mean, on the outset, just sort of reading it over, and forgive me, I don't want to offend, but it like sometimes we see studies that and I think this was the purpose of this study, so maybe that's part of it. But sometimes we see research studies, especially in the media, of confirming really obvious things, researchers now prove that cigarette smoking is actually bad for you, or researchers have done a randomized control trial and proved that driving with or without alcohol, alcohol is worse, and maybe not that obvious. But I've seen a lot of those things. I'm like, what? Why are we even researching this? And so when I read this one, and again, I think as I got deeper into it, I started to see more of the point here. But initially, I was like, so you're saying that if we do FCT, in one setting, and then with an individual, and then that individual moves. So typically a clinic setting, that's often kind of the way it works, or a hospital setting or something like that, or an outpatient setting. And then the individual moves to a home setting, then we often see problems happen because, and essentially it's sort of, as I read it, it sort of tells me, well, that's because, no generalization training was done. And so, they move to a different context, and, stimulus control is, an obvious piece there, and there's problems. So first off, maybe, am I totally off? Question one. And then two, what was the point of this study?
Yeah, so I guess maybe the best place to start is to describe kind of what this renewal model is and why that's important and why people should even care about it.
Absolutely.
So renewal in its, I guess, most fundamental form is it's both a process instead of procedures, but what we're really looking for is what effect do contextual variables have on the reemergence of a treated behavior. In other words, is there something controlling behavior beyond the immediate contingencies when a behavior relapses? So renewal is a model of relapse. There are other models like resurgence and reinstatement, but renewal is one of those. And what makes renewal a bit special and unique compared to the others is that we're looking at, how the context affects behavior as opposed to, let's say, a treatment integrity issue, which is what you might see in resurgence.
I see.
So in renewal, we're typically studying whatever the problem behavior is in three different kind of phases. So the nice thing about kind of this model is that it mimics really well onto the way that we typically treat behavior problems. So imagine that you have a young kid with disabilities who engages in aggression. And they're aggressing towards mom and dad pretty heavily at home. And they're doing this because they want their favorite toy. Let's say it's the iPad. So at home, you could say aggression occurs to get the iPad.
Yep.
So at this point, the caregivers will probably say, well, we need some help here, right? Our child's aggressive. We're going to seek out behavioral services. And oftentimes, when a caregiver seeks out behavioral services and the target behavior is somewhat intensive, like aggression, the behavior analyst might say, I can help you with this, but I can't do it in the home setting. I'll need to bring the child into my setting. Let's say it's a clinic, and I can better control the environment. I can reduce the behavior. And then once I develop a treatment that works for your child, we'll bring it back to your home. So what's happening in the situation is we're removing the child from that initial setting, the home setting, and we're taking them into a new setting. And we're saying, okay, we're going to develop a treatment in this new setting, like the clinic. And so the child comes into the clinic. We develop, let's say, functional communication training as an intervention for aggression. So this might consist of, teaching the child to say, can I have the iPad? And when aggression occurs, we don't give the iPad, extinction. So kind of a pretty standard FCT procedure. And what happens usually is what you would hope to happen is the aggression goes down and the communication goes up, right? So we would say intervention is successful.
Yeah.
So the behavior analyst at this point would say, okay, intervention's effective. Let's take it to the home setting, right? That's the setting in which the problem behavior is occurring. But before we do that, let's bring the caregivers in. We'll train them on this procedure, right? Because caregivers are probably not going to be familiar with what FCT and extinction means. So we'll bring them into the home setting, the clinic setting. We'll train them on these procedures. We'll make sure that there's 100% treatment integrity, so they know exactly how to do this. There shouldn't be any problems. And then we'll go back to the home setting and we'll try it out. So now you're back home, and the caregivers are implementing this FCT and extinction procedure that they were trained on. And they're implementing it with 100% treatment integrity. But what's interesting is what happens in that type of context change is that the aggression reemerges. And the reason why this is a somewhat interesting phenomenon is because the caregivers, are implementing the treatment correctly because you trained them on this, right? So it's not the case that the problem behaviors are occurring again because of some treatment integrity issue, which is what you might normally think, like maybe they're not doing it correctly, or maybe they made a mistake, and that's why the problem behavior came back. But what's actually happening is that in this case, the child has a very unique learning history between problem behavior and the home setting. And when they're back home, that context, those discriminative stimuli, the larger contextual environment starts to evoke the problem behaviors again. Despite the fact that the most immediate history that the child has is that problem behaviors on extinction. So kind of the interesting thing that happens here is that whenever we try to generalize treatments from one context to another, which happens a lot, right? From clinic to home, from school to home, or from clinic to school, right? We're trying to move treatments around. Is that prior learning history that somebody has with a context can sometimes result in a relapse of a problem behavior. And so the child starts engaging in aggression again. And so what happens is you have kind of this direct conflict between the immediate intervention that I just experienced, and this more historical contextual control. And so the reason why this is interesting, and you might think, well, isn't it obvious that the behavior would come back? It's not super obvious, because we wouldn't expect it to come back if the caregiver is implementing the treatment with 100% integrity.
Yeah.
But it does. And what's also cool about this phenomenon is that this entire procedure, the one that in the study that you're referencing, was based off of an experimental model of renewal, which is something that was observed in non-human animals. And so we thought, well, why don't we try to take this and see if there's kind of generality of this procedure to a clinical situation. So the study is really showing that you get these renewal effects even in clinical settings. And so it was kind of this a demonstration of relapse to further kind of investigate this and hopefully eventually develop strategies to mitigate that contextual control. Yeah, so it's something that maybe you might think would happen, but the reason it happens is a little bit different than what you might think intuitively, and that is really informed by this basic experimental model. And so this study is really a great example of translational research, where we've taken this somewhat unknown model of relapse, although renewal has been studied in the basic experimental literature for decades. So initially as kind of this respondent conditioning procedure, and more recently as an operant conditioning procedure. And so we've taken this model that previously wasn't studied very much, or at least wasn't acknowledged, and we've taken it into a clinical setting and saying, hey, this is important. We should really be aware of this and potentially program for better ways of generalizing.
So in this study, so that's okay, and that makes more sense, and then now I see why you did it. So thank you. I take it back. So a couple of things. So first off, I'm wondering about the ethical piece of this study. So this is a type of study where your successful result is, and maybe I just missed the detail, which is quite possible. The successful result is, we see that resurgence in that different context, and so now we sort of observed that process. Was there sort of another step, maybe not published, or where you then, tried to sort of treat the situation in the home so that these kids aren't now coming home and having problems?
Yeah, absolutely. So even with this type of study, which is translational and is a demonstration of a problem, we still try to do this in kind of the most socially valid way, right? Yeah. So when we originally designed the study, when we met with caregivers and we kind of explained, what this relapse model was and why we're interested in it. Part of it was explaining to them that if we can better understand this problem, then we can better sort of protect against it and develop a more robust treatment for your child. And caregivers were very much on board with that, because they don't want a treatment that's going to break down as soon as it comes home, right? They want something that's going to endure across time. And so when we framed it in this way of explaining that, well, we have to kind of see if this is going to happen before we can solve the problem, they were definitely much more on board. So that's kind of the first piece. The second piece is that you're right, that after the study, and I think there is a line in there somewhere in the method that we went to lengths to ensure that the behavior wouldn't relapse. So once we sort of demonstrated what we wanted to see experimentally, it didn't stop there. We kind of now are done with this kind of research piece, and we're focusing on, well, let's make this treatment more effective in the home setting. So there was definitely another piece of this which doesn't get reported on in the paper, unfortunately. I think it's a cool piece, but there's only so many pages that you can read a research article. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. There's definitely another piece where we actually reduce the behavior in a clinically significant way and then generalize it to the home setting.
Yeah. And again, I'm not familiar with even this model of sort of and I think because I kind of work in a bit of a different context, but I'm not even familiar with sort of this model of, child has problem behavior, we take them to the clinic to treat it. Like, I actually haven't really heard of that as a thing. And now, I work primarily, I'm more in supervision now, but historically I worked primarily, in that kind of setting. You had mentioned the adult kind of group home setting. But like our sort of model at the company I work at is entirely parent training, and so we don't have a clinic, and so we just kind of go in and do it in the home. Now, that said, and I can see why one would go to a clinic. It's difficult, because you're right. There are so many uncontrollable variables that make trying to teach a parent how to deal with, some severe aggression or self-injury or property destruction or whatnot, very difficult and very stressful. So certainly I can see the appetizing piece of, you take my child and make him better, and then teach me how to do it. And that can work really nicely. So that makes sense to me. But I'm also really familiar with, a lot of the work, and it goes all the way back to kind of Stokes and Bear, but in generalization, and there's all these sort of different ways of doing generalization. I know, like, Rob Horner did a lot of work on that, kind of in the 70s and 80s, but we don't see a lot of research. And I know we're kind of digressing here, but we don't see a lot of stuff today where there's a lot of that generalization component as part of the study. Is it just that folks don't do generalization, like that we sort of need this piece? Because to me, I was like, well, we trained FCT in the clinic. Okay, now let's go into the home, but we'll bring, we'll bring some pieces. Or in the clinic, we might have the kid's favorite chair from home. We'll bring that to the clinic, so that goes back to the home as some form of similar context. You kind of know where I'm coming from here. Like, I'm just kind of wondering why there isn't more of that in there.
Yeah, so I guess you're asking sort of the sort of the dearth of studies that report on generalization and maintenance once the study's published. And it's a great question. It's something that we've been thinking about as well, and we're actually in the process of conducting a study that looks at that kind of piece, which is what are the reasons why people don't report on generalization. And I don't know if the problem is that folks are doing it and not reporting it, or that they're not doing it, right? Because it could be the case that, similar to the study that we did, where we're definitely introducing procedures for generalization, but we're not able to report them in the research. So I'm not 100% sure kind of, which boat we're in. But certainly if you look at the literature on the treatment of behavior disorders, there's not very many reports of generalization or maintenance, which might be another issue, which is, we develop a treatment that works. Let's say we do generalize it across settings, but, how long does that maintain? Does it maintain for a week? Does it maintain for a month? Does it maintain for a year or longer? And so some of the work that we're doing now is we're really focusing on not only the demonstration of a treatment effect or a demonstration of an intervention, but also demonstrating the longevity of that over time.
Nice.
And I think, the issue is really around these sort of two types of research that people are doing. There's what we would call efficacy research, which is really focused on kind of internal validity. Let me demonstrate that this treatment procedure that I developed does solve the problem, which is great. You need those types of studies because we need more research on interventions that work. But there's another class of interventions, which we call effectiveness research. And effectiveness research focuses on the external validity of treatment procedures. So not only demonstrating that treatment works, but that it also works under the situations and contexts in which it's supposed to work, right? Which is for you and I in clinical settings, that's in the individual's typical environment.
Yeah.
It's not in a clinic. It's not in, an arbitrary sort of contrived situation. It's, I want the intervention to be effective for this person in their daily life, in the types of environments that they normally experience. And so I think, along with what we were talking about earlier in terms of translational research and bridging the gap between basic and applied sciences, I think we need more research on effectiveness, which bridges the gap between treatment's effectiveness and its durability in the natural environment. And so some of our more recent research is trying to incorporate those measures of maintenance, like a probe that's maybe a year after we work with a child. And it's not easy to get those types of measures. And I think that might be one of the reasons why we don't see it a lot, because it's difficult to track participants for long periods of time after we've worked with them. Sometimes, these are for reasons that we can't control. So, for example, when I was working in the US, a lot of the kids that we worked with and the adults we worked with, we were able to see them because of insurance funding, right? So there was money available to help these clients out. But oftentimes insurance, providers, they don't want to pay for you to track a kid for a year, right? And so unfortunately, that is one of the variables that controls this type of thing. But there are reasons why I think that it's difficult to get measures of generalization and maintenance, despite the fact that they're super important. And one of our defining characteristics of ABA is generality. Right? So we can kind of get better at demonstrating generality.
I think this, first off, just bravo. It's wonderful to hear that you're kind of moving in that direction, because this is something I'm always thinking about. There's sort of a couple pieces that are, and you said both key words today in terms of sort of things that we're not seeing enough of in studies. One is, like you say, the generality of maintenance, and two is the social validity. We're not seeing enough social validity measures, sort of throughout studies and sort of from all the different perspectives. And it's nice to see you're kind of doing both. In terms of the kind of the long-term maintenance, I've interviewed a couple folks now. We talked about just that, how so many studies have sort of, the 2-week follow-up or the 1-month follow-up and then goodbye. And so you're right, there's no sort of, those are all, I guess, as you say, those are all efficacy studies. They really show that, the intervention works. But, I wouldn't be surprised that many of them will, those studies and the folks that, the subjects in those studies probably experience some level of renewal, resurgence or whatnot, because of that. I interviewed Joe Lucician out here at UBC, and all he does is longitudinal kind of research in that way. So he does kind of a family-centered kind of PBS ABA interventions, but then he always does at least a year follow-up, but he often does 2 years, 3 years. He's got one study out that did 7 years. And when I interviewed him, he was, he said he had it on in his agenda to go reach out to a family for, I believe it was a 12-year follow-up.
Wow.
And that just speaks to that, like you said, that sustainability, that effectiveness, kind of that intervention. I interviewed Denny Reed a couple days ago. That one hasn't been published yet. He had a study, and he does now. He's in a different realm. He does staff training primarily, but he had a study of a 30-year example of maintenance of skills, training staff in a particular agency, and showing 30 years later the staff were still implementing those programs with fidelity, and to me that stuff is just so much more powerful and can really kind of translate to real life. So it's great to see that you're doing that work.
Yeah, and kind of tying this back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of these different relapse phenomenon, is that one thing that we're learning a lot through this translational research is that relapse is fairly common, not only in the form of renewal, but other types of relapse like resurgence that we didn't get a chance to talk about yet. But these phenomena are fairly common, and we should almost expect for them to happen. And so when we publish a study that doesn't have long-term maintenance and follow-up, we're kind of putting out the picture that, this intervention will work and you don't have to worry about anything else, where in reality, we know based on our research on relapse, that relapse happens fairly commonly. And so we need to actually develop procedures to mitigate that. And we'll never really know about the frequency of it unless we report on maintenance and generalization.
Yeah. The second secret word is scratch. I think maybe just as you just touched on it, I don't know if you actually have specific research in the area, but it would be nice for myself and for the listeners to have a better understanding of what resurgence and reinstatement are, what they look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I can probably send you some notes and studies that you could maybe, provide for folks who are more interested in it.
Absolutely, yeah.
But yeah, resurgence it's another totally other different model of relapse. But
right.
There's more research out there suggesting that these different models, although we sometimes treat them differently, they interact, a lot in the natural environment. So
gotcha.
It actually might be better to think about them together as opposed to separately.
Oh, fair enough. That's cool. Yeah, no, we'll definitely we'll put some of those suggested readings in the show notes for folks if they kind of want to learn a little more about those other three. Because I think for some folks this is all new. I mean, the idea of renewal, particularly, I think I think of sort of the work we do where at our agency, where we are just briefly, the services we provide are all 100% funded by kind of government bodies, so free for families, but they're limited time, 6 to 12 months sort of thing. And, you do what you can, you do parent training and kind of try to get those results. But we have no idea sort of whether renewal or resurgence or reinstatement even occurs sort of after the fact. We don't, you don't really get that data. And so, I mean, it would be interesting, I guess, number one, to know, how common is it really? And then two, sort of, do we have the right systems in place, to kind of address those things? We're putting all this money into sort of supporting, these families in these, very difficult, high stress kind of contexts, and then leaving them kind of happy, and then only to find out maybe a year later they're revisiting. And I think this is sort of where this may explain in part why I often see the same name, on a wait list year after year after year.
Yeah. And the examples that we've been talking about have been around kind of, assessment treatment of behavior disorders and individuals with disabilities or autism spectrum disorder. I think that's because, probably a lot of the listeners work in those types of settings.
Yep.
But what's really neat about these relapse phenomenon is that they're pretty robust across different types of problems. So, imagine that you have somebody who is a drug user, and at home they use drugs frequently, and then they're moved to a context where they're receiving treatments, let's say a rehab facility, right? So this is a different context now. And at the rehab facility, their drug-seeking behaviors don't contact reinforcement. There's no drugs available. They meet the criteria for discharge, and then they go back home, the setting where they used to use drugs, right? So this is something that is fairly common that we might have heard of before, which is when somebody goes back to the setting or the environment or the neighborhood or around the same people that are correlated with that drug, the drug behaviors reemerge. So we've been talking about the context of problem behavior, but I kind of just wanted to give that example because these models have generality beyond just problem behavior.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I could just see it in even in the context of even like learning to drive or and kind of those kinds of skills, and then jumping into a different vehicle that's completely different, having a lot of problems, or drinking, and obvious problems there that sort of, affect those skills that you've learned. So I could totally see this, carrying over across a lot of different areas. I did mention sort of 3 studies today that I kind of wanted to dive into. I was going to kind of jump into the deletion syndrome article, but I'm just looking at the amount of time we've put into this discussion, which has been amazing. I don't want to run out of time for the other article. So I think maybe we'll jump into that one. And if we have time, we'll come back to the deletion article. Because I think essentially the deletion article is just a nice example of sort of ABA being used with in a different sort of diagnosis that we're normally used to. But there will be some familiarity, I think, in some of the stuff in that paper otherwise that you could apply to sort of other settings. But this other article that you did is really interesting and really neat, and also really, no pun intended, but really meta in the sense that it took my brain on a kind of a roller coaster ride, sort of trying to kind of figure out what was happening here. But as we go along, the confusion does seem to get explained a little more. So this is shifting sort of from the sort of the translational research to something I think we're seeing a lot more of, which is wonderful. And you touched on sort of, getting involved more in work around social issues. And this particular article, which is timely, and I think we've seen a lot of good work coming out from a lot of different people in a lot of different areas as it relates to racism. For those, no one will know when this episode is released, but in terms of sort of today's recording day, yesterday was the first annual Canadian sort of Truth and Reconciliation Day, where a lot of conversations were being had around sort of systemic racism as it relates to Canada's Indigenous, or to the Indigenous folks that live in what they would aptly call sort of the colonized state of Canada. And so it's fresh of mind, and so reading this article again was it was helpful to kind of have that in the background as well, as we do a lot of work in this area. So this article is called Systemic Racism and Cultural Selection: A Preliminary Analysis of Metacontingencies. And right away, you want to make sure you have a cup of coffee and a good amount of sleep before you open this up, because it's going to get you thinking, and you may have to kind of go back and reread a few times. And I see you wrote this with Hannah Vance, and I guess one of your I guess amazing grad students that have brought you some of these really nice new topics. So maybe tell me a little bit about sort of where the idea for this article came from, and then we can kind of dive into kind of what it's all about.
Sure. So I'll definitely start off by saying that a ton of credit to Hannah for working on this paper. She definitely has been spearheading a lot of the research we've been doing around kind of social justice issues.
Amazing.
And so how this kind of came to be was sort of around the time that, COVID-19 was becoming a more serious issue around the world globally. Here where we were in a lockdown, and so we couldn't really go out for a lot of things except for those essential activities. And this put a bit of a damper on what Hannah and I were planning in terms of research, because a lot of applied behavior analytic research involves going out into the community and working with people and interacting and sort of being out there. So we were kind of unable to do that. And around the same time was sort of the same, around the same time was when we started to hear more about issues of systemic racism. It's when the Black Lives Matter movement started to become more prominent. It's around when issues around injustices to Indigenous individuals became more prominent. So there's a lot of things happening around that time. And so because we couldn't really go out and do research, a lot of our sort of lab meetings were just kind of theorizing about what's happening in the world and why are these things happening, and is there anything that we can do from a behavior analytic perspective to sort of address these issues, or at least to better understand them. And that's when we started to kind of think about and talk about this concept of a meta-contingency, which is something that Skinner did talk about in some of his early work. He talked about what we'd call natural selection, operant selection, and then this kind of cultural selection. And right away, when you start to think about this meta-contingency idea, it becomes very easy to connect it to cultural issues. And I think systemic racism and related problems are cultural issues. And so I guess, maybe I'll just quickly give an example of a meta-contingency for those who are completely brand new. But typically we think of a meta-contingency as kind of a contingency that operates on other contingencies. This is where the meta kind of comes from.
Yeah.
So, and a common example that often is given around this idea is that of a restaurant. So in a restaurant, you have, let's say, a server, you have a chef, and you have a hostess. And these individuals, all of their behavior are controlled by different immediate contingencies, reinforcement contingencies. But collectively, their individual behaviors come together for some common outcome, whether that be, getting a paycheck or a good review for the restaurant. So it's the behavior of lots of people that are working together in kind of this interlocking way to produce some outcome. And so that's the meta part of it, which is that there's this bigger contingency that's operating on these kind of smaller contingencies. And so when we wrote this paper about issues of systemic racism, and really this idea can apply to any type of discrimination, is we started thinking about, well, what are those bigger contingencies that operate on the smaller individual behaviors? And the behavior analytic research has many papers and examples of individual acts of racism. So let's say like a racial slur, something that you could analyze on an individual kind of level.
Yeah.
But systemic racism doesn't really operate on individual level. It operates on systems level, right? It's the institutions, it's the organizations. It's often implicit, right? Like a racial slur is very explicit, but a systemic issue is not explicit. It's built into the culture. And so we started talking about, well, maybe this issue of meta contingencies can help us explain issues of systemic racism. And so we started applying some of these ideas about culture to race and sort of how these things develop. And if you think about many kind of wealthy, prominent first world countries, there are races that sometimes benefit more than others.
Yep.
And so we talked about, well, why is that? And why do those ideas perpetuate? Even when you and I have good intentions about not doing that and stopping those systems, they still tend to perpetuate. And it's because these contingencies operate in a very implicit way. And so we talk a little bit about this in the paper around kind of how do you get around this issue and how can we actually address it if we can address it. And we, at the end of the paper, we do kind of provide some suggestions for how we can go about tackling systemic racism. And I don't think the ideas are particularly surprising.
Yeah.
They include things like, incorporating different voices into this discussion and establishing systems that are inclusive. So the I guess the solutions that we sort of try to put out there aren't particularly, I think, novel or unique, but I think our analysis of systemic racism and systemic discrimination is kind of the unique part, especially from a behavior analytic perspective, because certainly there's other fields that have contributed to this literature on racism and discrimination, other social sciences, probably even anthropology and social work and other sciences. But no one's really ever tried to tackle this from a purely behavior analytics standpoint, which is what we try to do. And part of the reason why we call this a preliminary analysis is because it had to be preliminary because there's not much work in the area. There's not much experimental work or applied work or really kind of good data to support what we're putting out there. And so this was really an exercise in interpretation and getting people to start thinking about this stuff so that maybe it could incite some research that would potentially support the ideas or refute them. So it is kind of preliminary analysis, but hopefully it has gotten people at least thinking about the issue.
No, I mean it makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're right. I mean, and I'm glad you sort of brought up that sort of the solutions are somewhat obvious, certainly not simple by any means. I mean, essentially, you're recommending systemic change in sort of different ways, and it almost, I don't know if sort of, the reversal is possible of sort of, looking at, and forgive me if I'm not even thinking about this correctly, but if you're looking at kind of, the bigger meta contingency, is there a way, I'm wondering, is there now a way to sort of work backwards and determine, and analyze deeper what those, interlocking behavioral contingencies are, and then, potentially start, coming up with interventions to sort of address, those specific pieces in some way. The third secret word is Nebraska.
Yeah, we did try to give a couple of examples in the paper of these kind of interlocking behaviors.
Yeah.
And so, I think one of the ones we talked about was if you have certain institutions that benefit members who belong to those institutions, and those institutions would persist. So, for example, let's say you have a bank and a school and a grocery store. And these are all kind of owned and operated by the same group of people.
Yeah.
And the people who own and operate them also consumers of the other institutions, then all of those members benefit, right? And those folks who don't belong to the group or aren't part of the culture, let's say, they get excluded. And it becomes really hard for them to be part of the institution. And so one of those solutions that we talked about was we need to almost develop new systems and new cultural norms. But the part of the challenge with that is that with a cultural analysis, culture is something that trickles through generations. It's not something that we can easily address and change right now, today. That doesn't mean we can't do any work on the issue. It means that whatever we start to do in terms of solving this problem is likely something that our future generations are going to benefit from.
Yes.
And I certainly think that's a worthwhile endeavor. That the future is more inclusive, that the future doesn't have these discrimination issues, and we don't have these systems that benefit some folks and not others. And I think, once we start putting in the work now, we're starting to shift the culture. We're trying to change that meta contingency to be more inclusive. And hopefully the goal is that in the future generations can really benefit that and to live in a world where these systemic issues are no longer issues.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I had a fella reach out to me. I'd gone to ResearchGate and just request articles, and that seem of interest, and had a fella send me one and reach out. We're going to chat next week, and they just put out an article that sounds like it might. Like I was surprised not to see your article referenced in his, because he starts to talk about some of these sort of steps we might be able to take to sort of, almost, he doesn't refer to metacontingencies, but to sort of, reframe some of these, I guess, interlocking contingencies and come at it from a different angle. And this is fellow Rocco Catrone, if I'm pronouncing his name right. Mm-hmm. And he had just put an article out and came out in July called "On the Importance of Listening and Intercultural Communication for Actions Against Racism." And he gives a nice sort of series of steps folks can take to, essentially, interact better with other cultures in order to sort of maybe, like you said, kind of change that narrative and down the road maybe see some good stuff. What you mentioned Hannah, and I definitely will reach out to her at some point as well. Maybe see if I can have her on, because I'm interested kind of what else her and yourself and maybe others in your group are kind of looking at as it relates to these kinds of issues. Like, what are you working on now?
Yeah, so one sort of interesting outcome of doing this analysis was that we started thinking about the field of applied behavior analysis as its own cultural system, right? Because we all belong to this field. We're all members of it, so we all contribute to the institution of ABA or EAB. And so one of the things that we started looking at was, well, our field probably isn't immune to this stuff, because we've seen that other fields have reported issues of discrimination or inequities. And so one of the things that we completed a few months ago, and it's currently under review, was we were interested in if there was any kind of inequities around how behavior analysts are paid. So we were able to acquire self-report of different behavior analysts at different annual salary. And we started looking at if there were differences based off of the gender of the individual and differences based off of the race of the individual. And then the combination of that, if somebody was a racial and gender minority. And lo and behold, we found what other fields have reported is that, our field also tends to pay women less than men at the same level of experience, the same certification.
Wow.
Tends to also pay minority races less than majority races, although not to as great of an extent, which is great. But certainly when those variables are combined, so race and gender, those individuals seem to be paid a lot less than the majority gender and race. And we found this to be true across levels of experience, right? So whether you're an RBT or BCBA or otherwise, we tend to see this outcome. So that's a paper that we currently have under review. And hopefully that'll be accepted and come out soon. But it's an example of our field being a culture and participating in these discriminations, albeit unknowingly, right? So I was saying earlier that oftentimes this is it's an implicit phenomenon. Right? No one's usually intentionally trying to develop systems of racism or discrimination, but nonetheless, in our study, we were able to find that. And so that's sort of one thing that's on the horizon. And the other thing that's on the horizon is sort of follow-up to that study was we thought, well, okay, if this problem exists, what are some solutions to that? And what's the social validity of these different solutions? So currently we have a study that's underway that looks at potential solutions to issues of pay discrimination in ABA and the social validity of those different options. So that one's still kind of underway in the early stages. So not really sure what that's going to how that's going to turn out. But ultimately, what we would like to do is something where we can go into a workplace and evaluate the pay structures and see if they're equitable. But maybe getting an organization to let us come in and do that might be a bit of a challenge. But that's kind of our ultimate goal in this work.
Absolutely, no, that's really cool, and I think it's really important. Was that the dog finally? I think
that was my squeaky chair.
There we go. I think it's important, that if we as a field are going to, make suggestions for, how, how we can, sort of improve inequity and engage in sort of anti-racist, behaviors for sort of other fields and other folks in general. We really need to sort of, as it were, get our own house in order and deal with those pieces. So I think that's amazing that you're kind of looking at pieces that we can sort of do internally, because certainly if we can, over time, address those issues internally, we'll have a lot more credibility when we're trying to sort of help other fields kind of do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And if the goal of our science is ultimately to produce socially significant change in the world, what better place to start than here, right? If we can identify those issues within our own field, let's get that sorted out, and let's study ways to improve that before we start putting that message out for other folks.
Yeah, totally. We have a little bit of time left. I suppose we could do a little bit of a review, since we did mention it in the beginning, and it's a lot of editing to take things out. To just touch on this other article as well. Again, we're for the listeners, we're taking like sort of three, completely different directions with today's podcast. First, talking about translational research and renewal, and some really interesting pieces there, to diving into important social issues, particularly systemic racism, to now, kind of looking at behavioral interventions that go beyond autism. I think it's interesting that I think that this is coming out of Brock, because I know several of your folks that have sort of been, professors for a longer period were involved in writing that great text that I have, the Genetic Syndromes and Applied Behavior Analysis book, by Dorothy Griffiths and Rosemary Kondalak, and both Canadians, and both down at Brock, doing some great work. And so it's nice to see. I often open that book looking up genetic syndromes, and I don't find the ones I'm looking for, because there's just so many of them out there, as we know, with sort of a lot of these, chromosomal related symptoms. There's the deletion or addition is so, there's just so many combinations, and I'm not a geneticist by any means, but to sort of add a piece of a gene or take a piece of a gene off, or add a couple spots here, or whatever, it completely changes the game for somebody in so many different ways, and results in, often these rare disorders that don't get a lot of attention and don't get a lot of support. Autism has become so prevalent. I think I remember when I started in the field, which wasn't eons ago, it was 1 in 20,000 kids got autism, and now we're into 1 in 40s or something like that. And so the prevalence is so high, and so the research is so high, and there's lots of information available. So I really wanted to touch on this article just for that piece alone, that you folks are taking something relatively rare and putting some work into it, and I really, first, I just want to commend you folks for kind of addressing that. I know Louis is the first author on this, and so you may get into the fact that this was a lot of his doing, and I wouldn't be surprised. He's a great advocate and a great researcher. So maybe with that, you could just tell us a little bit about what the heck 22q11.2 deletion syndrome is. That really rolls off the tongue. And just maybe just a little overview of this study.
Yeah, so it's certainly a one of the rarer, I think, genetic disorders. It's also called DiGeorge Syndrome, in case anybody's interested in looking it up. But how this sort of came to be was that Louis, who you mentioned is the first author on this study, he was working with a couple of individuals who both had this genetic, in this case, deletion, which was a bit of a kind of an interesting coincidence because of its rarity. And so, he did what most good behavior analysts would do, which is there anything in the behavior analytic literature on this condition? And there wasn't. And so him and I connected about it, and we thought, well, if there's nothing out there on this, and it's a problem, or it's a genetic condition that behavior analysts might come into contact with, can we do something to add to the literature? And so we started working with these two adults, and what makes the condition a bit unique is that these individuals characteristically are fairly impulsive and don't have great self-control. And along with that, there's problem behaviors that co-occur because of this kind of impulsivity and impatience. And so, one word that often kind of gets thrown around is treatment resistant, that they wouldn't respond to behavioral intervention because of this impulsivity would interfere, and we wouldn't be able to get any work done. So Louis and I kind of thought, well, why don't we try? We'll go in with our function-based treatment approach. We conducted functional analyses, and we developed treatments for these two individuals who both engaged in, the one engaged in aggressive behavior, and the second participant engaged in inappropriate touching of others in the environment. This was an adult man, so he was, touching women inappropriately. And so we developed treatments for these two individuals that were effective, and the treatments themselves weren't particularly novel. They were essentially different forms of differential reinforcement. The way they were executed was quite interesting, and credit to Louis for developing these. One of them was we developed kind of a token system based off of scratch lottery tickets. So you have to go to the gas station.
Yes, I read that.
Scratch lottery ticket. So one of the individuals we're working with, he loved kind of these scratch tickets. So we created a bunch of these sort of fake scratch tickets for appropriate behavior, and if he complied with the requests that we asked, like cleaning up his bedroom and putting his laundry away and stuff that the staff wanted him to do around the home, he would earn these scratch tickets. And so it was this kind of DRA procedure that was really effective for him. And the other individual we taught to request for attention appropriately, as opposed to touching people when they didn't want to be touched. And so the interventions were kind of different variations of differential reinforcement. But there are two kind of cool things about this study. The first was that we demonstrated that you could take this behavioral approach to treating these severe behaviors associated with this 22q11 syndrome, where previously in the literature, there was some skepticism about that. The most common treatment for these individuals was psychotropic medication.
Yes.
So the kind of way that the literature was pointing was, well, if you have this individual who engages in problem behavior, you have to medicate, you have to go towards psychotropics. And we demonstrated in our study that, no, you didn't have to do that. We were able to reduce those problem behaviors without relying on these medications. So that was one cool thing. And then the other kind of cool thing about the study, and this kind of ties back to our discussion from earlier, was we conducted a 1-year follow-up with these individuals. So we went back, there was actually a couple of probes. I think it was like a 3-month, 6-month, and then 1 year we went back, and we demonstrated that, these behavioral interventions that we implemented, they endured over time. The client was still working for the scratch lottery ticket
Amazing.
at a much less intensity than before. So that's great because it was easily integrated into his natural environment. And the other participant was not engaging in the inappropriate touching, which is also great.
Yep.
So a nice demonstration there of the maintenance of the intervention, but also generalization to the natural environment for these individuals. So that was kind of the second cool thing about this study.
Really cool. Yeah. And high five to Louis, I have to private message him myself as well. But yeah, a lot of neat things about this study that I liked. In addition, well, first off, with the scratch tickets, I think that was really cool because first off, that was one of the tangible items that he was engaging in aggressive behavior when he wasn't able to always get access to. Isn't that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was neat. And I have seen those sort of make your own scratch tickets. I've never sort of understood the benefit, but I just read I think it was a post somewhere, and they're talking about token economies and how one of the most common sort of errors made with token economies is that you don't make the tokens generalized reinforcers first, condition reinforcers first, and so you have these tokens and people have no idea. But the nice thing for this study is that this was already generalized as a reinforcer for this guy. And so you probably didn't even have to sort of do that piece as much because he already sort of had an EO, as it were, to kind of have access to those scratch tickets. So that's really cool. Another go ahead.
The other kind of cool thing about those scratch tickets is that they were real scratch tickets in the sense that they weren't always winners. It wasn't the case that he got a scratch ticket and he always got something. Oftentimes he would get the scratch ticket and there wasn't anything to be won. So he was complying for just the chance of winning something. So
yes, of course. And that would be something he'd be used to because he wouldn't always win when he got a real scratch ticket. And so that wasn't a problem. And that made it so you didn't actually have to provide, continuous reinforcement kind of right away. That's really cool.
Exactly. So like I was saying earlier, is very amenable to kind of his natural environment and his sort of typical day-to-day activities.
So listeners out there, if you've got someone that likes scratch tickets, this is a great idea. Another thing that this kind of reminded me of, which as a bit pioneering, and hopefully, we see more of this as we go along, is this idea of, like if you say, of the DiGeorge primarily being treated through medication, and that behavioral treatments were not indicated and not recommended. And it reminded me, I chatted with, I'm going to be having Doug Woods on the podcast. And I was chatting with him a couple days ago. And for those that aren't familiar, Doug does a lot of work, probably the most work in terms of behavioral interventions with Tourette syndrome. And he was telling me sort of a similar story. And so it's sort of neat to see these kind of line up where when he first kind of got into Tourette's, it was the same deal. I don't know if it was the psychiatry system or the psychology system or whatever, but the field basically believed that you should not use behavioral interventions for Tourette's, and that only medication can address Tourette's. And he said, and that's kind of what we were up against. And, fast forward 30 years, and it's the number one recommended intervention for Tourette's. And so it would be wonderful, again, to see more studies like this, showing that effectiveness and efficacy and effectiveness long-term. And the long-term piece, I just love the follow-up, I think can really, open up doors. And just to kind of add to that point, I also noticed, and this is something that a few folks talk about, Pat Fryman in particular, is that you published it in a different journal. You published a journal, Developmental Neurorehabilitation, not necessarily a journal that, a behavior analysis would access, but possibly a journal that someone, who works with someone with a genetic syndrome might access. I even like the language in the abstract that you sort of, you didn't sort of make the assumption of that folks would know what ABA is, and like in the abstract for folks, and I'll have the link to the article here. It says using principles derived from operant behavioral psychology, and then so on. And then in the article you refer to a sub-discipline of operant behavior psychology known as applied behavior analysis, almost as if this is a thing that no one knows about. But for that audience, it probably is something that they might not know a lot about. So I thought it was a really nice way of kind of, introducing ABA and our work to sort of a new population, a new consumer. So I just thought all of that was really cool.
Yeah, and you're right that it was definitely intentional, because when we were doing this work, we thought to ourselves, well, applied behavior analysts aren't going to think that this is that interesting, because the intervention, or the independent variable of interest here was differential reinforcement, and behavior analysts have been using that forever, right? But somebody who knows nothing about ABA, that's going to be kind of a game changer for them. And so we want to put this into a journal where somebody who hasn't heard of ABA or hasn't heard of differential reinforcement could read this and not be bogged down by terminology issues, because the goal was really, here's something that works and it's an alternative to traditional approaches to treating behavior problems associated with DiGeorge syndrome. And now that this is out there, maybe more folks will be inclined to go this route as opposed to just purely medication. So it definitely was intentional, and we used kind of this more user-friendly language when describing these procedures, because the audience was hopefully non-behavior analysts.
Really cool. So we'll wrap it up there. I mean, this was, in the beginning, I was wondering, how are we going to connect these three studies and keep people's interest as we jump from random topic to random topic. But I'm really impressed and optimistic, I think, about the work that you're doing, the work that you and Louis are doing together. I can see you two becoming prolific writing partners going forward, as well as many of the, you and Hannah and many of the other folks that you're doing such good work with. But I really see, it's just so nice to see new research coming out that is, that's kind of thinking outside the box, not repeating the same stuff over and over again, and it's talking about stuff that is all really socially valid. I mean, an article on a rare genetic syndrome, so cool. Obviously the racism kind of focus and really kind of thinking about those stuffs internally in our field is really, really powerful. Kind of bringing back translational research to the masses, that for folks that maybe haven't had an exposure to it. Like I highly recommend this as sort of if you've never read any experimental sort of behavior work, I think this is a nice place to kind of start. And there's some wonderful references within this article, the renewal article, that you can then dive deeper if you really want to kind of get more information. There's a lot of folks referenced in the renewal article that I've never even heard of, that I imagine that look like they're probably doing some really neat work on things like ethical self-control and kind of all that stuff, which folks can kind of dig into. So just want to say, first off, thanks so much for being on the podcast. This is a really cool conversation, and I really got a lot out of it. But also just thanks a lot for kind of for taking this approach at work and kind of just putting out some stuff that I think is going to be really applicable to a much wider audience than maybe some of the stuff we've seen from folks in the past.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the time to come on here and chat about this work, and hopefully it will incite some interest in the listeners, and maybe more folks will start doing this work, and that would be great to build off this stuff.
Brilliant. And any of you kind of budding, graduate students out there, check out Brock University. I know a lot of folks outside of Canada may never have heard of it, but there's some really amazing work happening across the board over there. So check it out. Thanks again for being on the show, Val.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.